Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a good day and welcome to Meet a Village Resident. I'm Riki Stamps with Butterfield Trail Village, and I'm so honored to have Dr. Jerry Rose with us today. Jerry is a professor emeritus and former chair of the University of Arkansas Department of Anthropology. He loves bones, and we want to hear all about that today. Jerry, welcome. I'm
Thank
glad you're
you.
here. When did you join Butterfield?
11 years ago.
11 years. I feel like you're a close personal friend. We've known each other for that long, and it's been a joy to learn about you and your career. He's worked so many wonderful places, ladies and gentlemen, but the majority of his tenureship has been with the University of Arkansas, and he's got some exciting things to tell us about those years and several overseas adventures that we'll share. What I'd like to do, you were born in one of my favorite cities, and that's Boston, Massachusetts. So tell us a little bit about being born in Boston and your family.
Okay, well, I was born June 10th, 1947, in the Naval Hospital right outside of Boston. And my parents were veterans. My father was in the Navy, in the non-commissioned ranks, if you will. Uh, and his duties were as a radio man in a blimp. And he served in South America looking for lost U.S. airmen that decided to fly over the jungles rather than the coastline. And then he spent the rest of his tour um, looking for submarines off the coast of the Northeast America, New York and New England. My mother was an Army nurse, a lieutenant, and they met and I guess fell in love. My father was discharged from the Navy at the end of his tour. My mother, as an officer, served at the pleasure of the military. And they had to get a special exemption for an officer to marry an enlisted man, and so she was given a early discharge. And sometime after they were married, I was born. My father was going to school on the GI Bill, and my mother was working as a nurse in the Boston City emergency rooms. So eventually my father graduates from technical school and gets a job with the General Electric Company in Schenectady, New York, and off we go.
And then at this point, I mean, you moved to New York, correct?
Right, Schenectady.
Schenectady. Did I say it?
Yep.
Interesting.
That's basically where almost everything with General Electric was. And my father worked in the research labs as a technician, and eventually was able to work his way up for a promotion to engineer and was transferred to the Boston office. And so when I was 10, we moved to Walpole, Massachusetts, which is a small town outside the city limits. And since my father was assigned to the whole territory of New England, from one day to the next he could be in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maine, depending on the job. This was industrial engineering, so it would be big machine tools, paper mills, and so that was his job. And I went to school from the 5th grade onward in Walpole. And as to expectations of college, I'm not so sure whose expectations there were, but I read a lot of popular physics, and so I had a number of very favorite authors who were writing popular books, and they were teaching at the University of Colorado in physics. So my mother, in her wisdom, suggested that I apply to small technical schools to study engineering, and that I should apply for my dream school. Never can tell if that might happen. And eventually I was rejected at a number and accepted at a couple, and decided on a small engineering school not far from home, but far enough so that I couldn't live there. And sometime in the middle of summer, my parents get a telegram offering me a scholarship to the University of Colorado in Boulder. And after a great deal of debate, my parents agreed that they could afford to pay the in-state tuition, which is what I was offered. And my father arranged for a ride with the son of a friend who went to school there. And one day he showed up in his Volkswagen Beetle, and I put my little suitcase in the car, and off we drove to Boulder. As a good New Englander, I never left the western border of New York State, and so my view of the U.S. was kind of biased: cowboys and Indians in Pennsylvania and plantations in New Jersey. But it was quite an adventure going across to Boulder, where I got dropped off in my dorm in the week of freshman orientation. Eventually, I was seen by my advisor from the physics department.
So your course of study at this point was strictly physics,
right?
correct?
That's what I applied to study, and so signed up for calculus, introduction physics, and all of the requirements of a freshman at the university. And back in those days, they did all kinds of calculations on your test scores and determined what your probability of getting a C or better in every single freshman class was. And my advisor said that I didn't have a chance in hell of passing a social science, so he had a special one that was really easy. And had I ever heard of anthropology? And I said, I didn't say anything. I just shook my head, and he said, well, you're taking that. Anthropology. So in the midst of taking my calculus and freshman English composition, etc., I also was taking this anthropology course. And in the second month or so of the semester, the teaching assistant of the course said that he was doing excavations in southeastern Colorado and was looking for volunteers, and he would pick us up at our dorms on Friday, drive us to his dig site. He would feed us, take care of us, and drop us off at our dorm on Sunday night. So never having left the campus, I raised my hand, and on Friday he picked me up, and off we went, where he had to, of course, instruct me into the basics of excavation. And what this really consists of, he's excavating and shoveling the dirt into a big screen. So think of it as a box with a window screen on the bottom, and you shake it, and all the dirt goes through, leaving the rocks and artifacts on top. And he taught me how to separate the artifacts from the rocks. The thing that was amazing was the fact that he was digging in an area where it never rained, under the sort of bluffs in this canyon land of Colorado. And we found corn cobs, corn kernels. Not only did we find the arrowheads, but we found the shafts that the arrowheads were on. And so this was amazing introduction. And with this experience, continued experience, working for this particular graduate student, by the end of the semester, I knew that I didn't want to be a physicist, but archaeology was where I was going to go, and that was basically it. And I specialized in anthropology, where we had to take cultural anthropology, the study of living people, archaeology, the study of people of the past, biological anthropology, which is the study of the human body, past and present, and linguistics. All of these courses were required to graduate.
What are some places that you excavated during this time?
In addition to volunteering with the graduate student, there were a number of training programs sponsored by the department, and one of them was at Mesa Verde, Colorado, which some of you may know, big cliff dwellings, and the university had a permanent research site there, and we excavated pueblos and kivas and various other kinds of features. Actually, I guess getting one section of Mesa Verde to be opened ultimately to the public. Another excavation opportunity I had was with the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, and one of their team members was excavating sites in above tree line, Continental Divide in Colorado. And this was a very unique experience, excavating game drive systems, which are basically huge lines of rocks running for miles that sort of funneled the deer and other creatures, bison and so forth, sort of punching them all together at the end, and the Indians would leap out of little pits and
in these
hunt.
earlier job sites, did you feel like the majority was Native American?
Yes, they were all Native
finds?
American cultures. And so I also worked on a site in Utah, in Dinosaur National Monument, not excavating dinosaurs, but excavating humans. And these sites were scheduled to be destroyed during project development of a big fishery in Dinosaur National Monument. So then, of course, a bachelor's degree in anthropology is only part way to achieving my goals of teaching at a university, and so had to choose a graduate school. And I applied to a number of graduate schools, but also back at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, which is our agricultural land-grant college in Massachusetts, which was growing by leaps and bounds while I was in Colorado. And so they had a good anthropology department. I was accepted there, and one day while I was cleaning out all my stuff from the place that I lived, getting ready to go home for the summer, being kind of lackadaisical about it, but ultimately, once again, this boy rides up on a bicycle and hands over a telegram, this time offering me a teaching assistantship, University of Massachusetts. So off I went.
Off you went, absolutely.
Amongst many other things, of course, you have to feed yourself in the summer times. And just by chance, somebody mentioned that there was an opportunity for excavations at Cahokia Mounds, which is in East St. Louis, Illinois, big state park, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee was excavating a huge mound there, and they needed somebody to excavate and analyze skeletons. So I had the opportunity to do that in the summer, so hopped in my car and drove to East St. Louis.
What year was that approximately?
1971.
Because as I've lived in Northwest Arkansas 30 years, I remember there was a big news story about the mounds again. It was in the local newspapers, but I don't remember exactly what the topic was, which would have been probably in the 2000s. So
Right.
I don't know if they've stopped excavating.
Excavations basically started many years before I got there and have continued to the present day.
Oh, okay. Well, that explains it.
But one of the unique things about this excavation is they had a large number of human Native American skeletons, and they were buried in the Mississippi River clay, so preservation wasn't very good. And
The drier the atmosphere, the better, correct?
right, and the sandier and better drained the soil, the better the preservation. And the bones were there, everything was perfect, but they were very fragile and moist and required development of techniques for analysis that I spent a great deal of time trying to figure out how to do. But ultimately, most important thing is the best preserved part of the skeleton, of every skeleton that we excavated, were the teeth. So we were able to recover all the teeth from every person. These I took back to University of Massachusetts to go back to class. And I spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out what to do with all the teeth. Make a long story short, I specialized my graduate study in teeth, dental anthropology, to learn what we could from teeth. And locked in the teeth are your entire childhood experience of disease and diet. We can see multiple episodes of fever. We can see when your diet didn't have enough protein. As an adult, the cavities that you had told us how much starch and sugar was in your diet. And the amount of wear on the teeth told us the consistency of the food that you were eating, whether it was made up mostly of ground grains and corns and breads like this, or meat and other softer materials. So, make a long story short, I finished my PhD with a specialty in dental anthropology.
Okay. I think it's interesting, and as we were talking earlier before this interview, was how much can be learned from the teeth. And I had a lot of fever when I was a child, and so I was curious when you were talking about diseases, if that was something that you could determine. And when you told me that, that was very interesting. But also, there's so many things that, like you said, their diet, their culture, I mean, just basically what was going on in their life at the time. And you documented all this, correct?
That's right. And then you sort of put it together to tell a story about the particular people that lived at that particular time and place.
Question. When you excavate somewhere and you take it to a university to study, is there any type of official paperwork or agreement with that state to return it or to provide them with your findings?
Well, there's an obligation, of course, to prepare the data and to write it up as a report and to publish it which is something that I did. Back then, there were not the kinds of laws that we have today, which basically makes you keep track of all the human material that you have. But ultimately, the skeletons that I excavated were returned to the Illinois State Museum, which is the official repository. And as I worked on other materials in other places, there were, as time went on, more very specific rules as to what happened to the human remains that were excavated.
You shared with me, Jerry, that your first job teaching was at the University of Alabama.
Alabama and Birmingham. And
sorry, we're going to beat Alabama this Saturday in
but
football.
not Alabama and Birmingham, though.
True.
But for me, this was a good choice because it had one of the best dental schools in the United States at the time. And they had a great library on teeth. And interestingly enough, they had an enormous collection of anthropology, of 19th and early 20th century anthropology publications in their special collections, because one of their anatomists had a long time interest in the subject of anthropology. So I got to read a lot of original things that I'd only heard about. So
because the school was so well known for dental research, other schools were sending skeletons to you for analyzing, correct?
Right. And one of the places that was sending skeletons for me to study was the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, which stationed here in Fayetteville. And in fact, the two founders of the survey were our past residents of Butterfield, and have, of course, long since passed away.
Sure. Who were they?
Esther Davis and Bob McGimpsey.
Bob McGimpsey, yes, we remember Bob.
And Esther lived in a cottage. And so I was sent skeletons from University of Arkansas. The students and I in Birmingham studied them, wrote reports, and sent the skeletons back. And I'd been teaching there 2 years when the Department of Anthropology here in Fayetteville decided they were going to hire a biological anthropologist. And I applied. And I applied primarily because I really liked the mountains and the environment of Arkansas. It was very much like Western Massachusetts, where I went to graduate school. And of course, didn't compare to Colorado, but the same kinds of environments. And even when we lived in Schenectady, we weren't very far from the mountains, and my parents would take us on picnics and vacations in the mountains of central New York. So what appealed was the environment. I applied for the job, and I was fortunate to be selected.
A little statistic, when Jerry first started at the University of Arkansas, you said there was a faculty of 7?
That's right.
And how many when you retired a couple of years ago?
I think close to 22.
So I think the University of Arkansas Anthropology Department definitely made a name for itself.
It did, and added faculty members, and a lot of them developed really fascinating programs. We have anthropologists who are very famous for finding human fossils in Africa and go there regularly. One of the other faculty members right now is in Siberia, and he's using his knowledge of dental anthropology to study little tiny creatures in the Russian Arctic who are having to change their diet because of global warming. And he with his Russian colleagues are documenting this climatic change by studying the scratches on the teeth of these small creatures.
That is very interesting. Of course, we know climate change is always in the headlines these days, and it's affecting every parcel of this country. It just touches everything. Um, so one thing that I thought was quite interesting, Jerry, when we were visiting yesterday, is you were at the University of Arkansas, and tell us about how you came to work with the Arkansas Medical Examiner's Office.
Okay. Well, the medical examiner based at the State Crime Lab in Little Rock had been sending skeletons found in the woods and various other locations to the Smithsonian, to the FBI, who then sent them across the street to the Smithsonian Institution for forensic analysis, which most of you are familiar with from television, where they can determine everything about the dead person using anthropological techniques. And one day the anthropologist at the Smithsonian was just getting overwhelmed with various things and just was having a bad day. And he packed up the skeleton with a note to the medical examiner that Arkansas had perfectly capable biological anthropologists, and so there was no reason that they should be bothering him with their skeletons. So I got this very nice little note asking if I would kindly analyze these skeletons for the medical examiner. So I and my students analyzed hundreds of skeletons, murder victims, missing persons, etc., for the medical examiner for 35 years.
Jerry, we might could come up with a television show.
So that's the story of the medical examiner.
So I think the year was around 1990 when you had a phone call from the University of Arkansas Foundation. Tell us about that and where that took you at that point in your life. It was about the work of going to the Middle East.
Okay. Actually, the phone call was from a foundation that was a private foundation that was based in, at the time, in North Carolina. But this goal of this foundation was to promote Egyptians analyzing and conducting research in their own country. So they're having a seminar on a variety of different topics in archaeology and biological anthropology to stimulate the interest of medical and dental professionals in Cairo to analyze skeletons being worked on by Egyptian archaeologists, rather than having the French and the Spanish and the Italians and the English and the Americans do all of the research. So I was invited to give this seminar that was part of a big program. There are a number of other people involved. And this was only my second time out of the country. And so I said that I would be glad to participate if I got to stay for a week. The seminar was 3 days, and I wanted to stay an extra 4 days. I figured that taking a 2-day journey by plane to get to Cairo and back was worth an extra couple days. And they agreed, and I participated in the seminar, and I made some lifelong friends, both amongst the speakers, many of whom I had heard of but had not met, and the Egyptian colleagues in the Egyptian research centers. Again, these are contacts that have lasted a lifetime. But I fell in love with Cairo. I fell in love with Egypt. not necessarily the archaeology per se, which was fantastic, but it was the place and the people. Although I love living in the mountains of Arkansas, I also very much like cities. And growing up in high school, believe it or not, my parents allowed us to take the bus into town, as we called it, and actually just wander around in the city of Boston. And over the years, I went to jazz clubs. I mean, I was only in high school, but you didn't order drinks. You could go and listen. I went to the Science Museum regularly. I went to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. I just wandered all over the place. So I really did love cities. Not so much the urban sprawl, but the city itself. Fell in love with Cairo, fell in love with the people, and I was determined to find a way to go back. And I contacted a colleague of mine who had similar interests, and we wrote grant proposals, and we got a little grant to go back and actually study the teeth of living Egyptian children.
Oh, okay.
Who these children had detailed medical records through their childhood. So we could then apply our techniques on their, by looking at their teeth and recording the information, and then we could do our analysis and then find out if we were right or not, because these children were examined on a monthly basis by Egyptian medical professionals, and these records were kept. So this was a unique opportunity, and while we were doing this kind of research, I spent a lot of time going around introducing myself to as many archaeologists as I could find. And ultimately, there was a Dutch archaeologist who was excavating skeletons in the Nile Delta, so equivalent to the Mississippi Delta. And the skeletons were buried in river clay, and the preservation was fairly poor. And none of the other people wanted to work on his skeletons, because if you excavated the skeletons that are found in the desert, they're beautifully preserved, as if they were cleaned in a medical facility.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody happened to mention to this archaeologist that Jerry Rose would work on his skeletons. From my experience at Cahokia. So I started going in the springtime and working with the Dutch. Ultimately, it was a Dutch-Russian expedition, and got to work with Russian colleagues, and it was a fascinating sight. And the skeletons indeed were poorly preserved, but the techniques of basically the skeletons had to be analyzed while they were in the ground. So everything was still there. You could collect all the data that you wanted, and even though the skeleton would break apart as you attempted to take it out, you'd already had all of your information.
Yeah.
And so I learned this as a graduate student working at Cahokia. And this was, I loved Egypt. I loved doing this. And so I worked with the Dutch and Russians. I excavated in the springtime. And so I taught all my classes in the fall semester. And so
Back at the University of Arkansas.
Back at the University of Arkansas, and spent 6 weeks to 8 weeks in Egypt every year. I was invited to work with an American team, and I excavated at a fairly famous site in southern Egypt. And here the skeletons were perfectly preserved. They were buried in the desert. We had everything, including hair, being preserved.
Interesting.
And so I worked with the archaeologists here studying their skeletons for about 3 years. We did about 350 skeletons were excavated and analyzed, and reports were written. And this led to ultimately an invitation to work with the British at the site of Amarna, which is the city of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Everybody knows the statue of Nefertiti with the blue crown.
Yes.
And also this is the birthplace of Tutankhamun. And so King Tut is somebody that everybody else is familiar with. And so I spent 12 years excavating here until just three years ago. And in all of these excavations, I brought students. So,
Are most of the students that you trained here still in anthropology? Have they stayed in touch with you? Which has to be, makes you feel really proud if they did.
some of them, a lot of them went on to careers in anthropology, but probably one of the most interesting was one day I got a knock on my door, and it was one of my former students who worked with me, and she was here visiting the university with a colleague, and they were from USAID, the American Aid Association, and she said that she just fell in love with the Middle East and continued her studies in Middle Eastern studies, not necessarily archaeology, but ultimately got an advanced degree and had spent her career with USAID, working in the Middle East. So that's just one example. People have gone on to teach anatomy in medical schools, to teach anthropology. I have a number of students who have went to work for various government agencies that were responsible for archaeological sites. And some of my first students working for the government have all retired, and one of them stopped by on his way to his retirement place in Florida or whatever it happened to be, and just to chat and say hello. So they've gone on to a whole variety of different careers.
Well, I'm sure you have influenced so many young people, and they're out there doing work as passionate as you are about your work. I want to back up just a second. You did spend time in Jordan as well, correct?
Yes. So that's an interesting story. So I am working in Egypt. So my first expedition to Egypt was 1990, and this is 1994. And the University of Arkansas got a huge gift from the Saudi government to create a Middle East studies program. And one of the first things that the director of this new program decided to do was to have take faculty members, I think 10 faculty members, on a 10-day or a little bit longer tour of the Middle East to meet people in Middle Eastern universities. And I was selected to be one of the first groups, and our group was visiting the country of Jordan and its various universities. And also we went on to Saudi Arabia, where we visited universities there. But what happened was we would go and visit 3 or 4 different departments at a university, and they would have some faculty members meet us, and we would talk about what kind of research that we were doing. I mean, we represented anthropology, political science, comparative literature, and so on. And then so we'd visit 3 departments on every university, let's say, and then we'd go on to a different one, and we would talk about shared teaching and research interests. So we're visiting Yarmouk University, which is in the north part of Jordan, and we are coming in, we're being introduced, and the faculty there are all lined up, and they're shaking our hands and greeting us, and we're going to go in and have our meeting. And one of the faculty members says, "Jerry, is that you?" And I looked at him and I said, "Mahmoud?" And we had been colleagues as graduate students. We didn't go to the same graduate school, but we went to the same, we went to the same professional meetings. So we knew each other from our student and post-student days. And he was a professor at the university there. And during the course of that afternoon, he said, let's get together and talk about some stuff. And so I made arrangements to stay behind from my tour. And they were going off to the Dead Sea to have a holiday, a day off, no official visits. So I met with Mahmoud, and we dreamed up this idea of having a joint field school where American students and Jordanian students would work together, and we'd have a joint project. And we did that from 1995 to 2007.
That's fascinating.
So every summer I would take American students, and we excavated churches and tombs. Our specialty time period was the Byzantine, so basically the first 700 years after the time of Christ. And we excavated 4 sites, and wrote up the results of our excavations, the analysis of the skeletons, the analysis of the artifacts and the tombs, and of course the churches that we excavated in these little ancient villages.
Are you still in touch with this gentleman?
Unfortunately, he passed away.
I'm sorry.
Suddenly from a heart attack. And it was really sort of my grieving over his death that resulted in the cessation of the joint program. And I didn't go back to Jordan with the field school after that. Although during this time period, several of the students we had in the field school had come to the University of Arkansas and gotten PhDs, and were faculty members back in Jordan, and I've been in touch with them continuously since that time.
You've touched so many lives, Jerry. You really have. I think that kind of work, when you're so passionate about something and you do touch these many lives, it just comes full circle with their passion and what they're doing, and hopefully they'll pass that along to the students that they have. One of the things that the worst decision I felt like I had to make was when I had to cancel Butterfield Trail Village's tour to Egypt. Back in early 20, we were scheduled to leave April 1st, and unfortunately, COVID hit, and that was the cause of us canceling that trip. But we were so ready and so excited to go, and Jerry was going to be the man who gave us insight that no tour guide could probably ever give us. However, it is still on my radar, and should we get through this pandemic to a safe measure, I hope that you would be willing to accompany us again, or accompany us on this journey, and tell us things that I'm starved to know, the things that you know. And it's not an area that I've ever even thought about, but it's just like the discovery you had, teeth. There's so many amazing things you can learn about other humans just through the teeth. But the fact that you've experienced these cultures and met such a wonderful group of people is just, I'm so happy for you. I really am.
Thank you.
I think it's a great career.
I like shopping too, and I buy all my clothes in Cairo.
Aha.
One of the reasons I have to go back is my shirts are running out.
Okay. We need to take Jerry on a shopping trip to Cairo, so be sure and let either one of us know if you'd like to go with us, probably in the next year or so. Jerry, thank you so much for visiting with us today. I appreciate the insight of your fabulous life and career, and I can't wait to see what you're going to do next.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.